Hello everyone, it's Jimmy. Today I'm going to briefly talk about the anti-black discrimination going on in China right now, especially in cities like Guangzhou and Wuhan. But right before I do that, I'm going to play this clip by Al Jazeera that briefly shows how black people in China have been kicked out of their houses and have been subjected to increased scrutiny by the government and Chinese people.
City leaders in southern China are denying allegations of coronavirus racism, insisting that foreigners are not being discriminated against. Africans living in Guangzhou say that they're being kicked out of their homes and face harassment as health workers step up testing for imported infections. The African Union, Nigeria, and Ghana are calling on the Chinese government to address concerns. Professor Keith Richburg is the director of the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong. He says there has been discrimination against Africans living in China for some time now.
Ever since Xi Jinping announced that the virus was essentially contained in China and that they could start reopening businesses and reopening factories, the numbers have been going up, but they've been blaming all of those new numbers, those new cases, and the new deaths in China on what they call imported cases, meaning that they've contained it in China, but people coming back into the country are bringing it along. It smacks a bit of xenophobia to me, because number one, most of these so-called imported cases are Chinese nationals who left the Chinese New Year and are just now returning, or returning from schools abroad, etc. So these aren't foreigners; these are Chinese who are bringing in the virus. And secondly, they've been given really no statistics to prove that the real numbers of people coming in with the virus are actually foreigners at all. But that's kind of the narrative or the storyline that they'd like to say, is that all of these new cases are all from foreigners. They've even restricted foreign diplomats from coming back into Beijing, for example. China has always had this kind of complex relationship with Africa, whereas officially, they see the African countries as brothers. Lately, China has put a lot of development money into Africa. They built the African Union headquarters. They built the railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa. But and as a consequence of these tens of thousands or millions of Chinese living in Africa, you also have a lot of African traders, African students who have gone over to China. And so, officially, on an official level, there's this kind of feeling of fraternity. On the ground level, people to people, the Chinese simply don't like them very much. They're basically there's a lot of racism. I've been to Guangzhou. I've been to that area that they call Little Africa, or more derogatorily, they call it the Chocolate City. The Africans tell me they feel discriminated against by the Chinese.
So, as you can see from the clip that we just watched, this whole pandemic has really helped to magnify the underlying racism that has existed in China since the 60s. And this racism, as we've seen, it's directed towards African people. And it's really illuminated the fact that Chinese people, they view African countries and their people as dirty and uncivilized. And thus they wrongly believe that Africans are more likely to transmit the coronavirus. Now, this whole story, it gets even worse when you realize that African community leaders in Guangzhou believe that the majority of the city's African population have been forced into quarantine or are sleeping in the streets. Earlier this month, online rumors began to circulate that parts of the city where Africans lived and traded were under lockdown after two Nigerians who had tested positive for COVID-19 escaped. So, Chinese media reported that a Nigerian patient had attacked a Chinese nurse. The Health Commission began widespread testing of African nationals. The local authority says it has tested every African national in Guangzhou for the coronavirus. They found that 111 of the more than 4,500 Africans in Guangzhou tested positive for COVID-19. Other businesses in Guangzhou that have been implementing discriminatory policies include a McDonald's branch. They even posted a note saying, "We've been informed that from now on, black people are not allowed to enter the restaurant." In fact, an African man was reportedly asked to leave a McDonald's in Guangzhou. And of course, they later apologized because they saw that there was a lot of backlash for this overtly racist policy that they had. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, BBC recently reported about a Nigerian student named Ade who was forced to abruptly vacate his apartment. 5 months earlier, he had moved to Guangzhou, which is in southern China, to study computing at Guangdong University. He had just paid his university fees for the new semester when his landlord informed him that he needed to leave. He quickly took his things, and the police were waiting for him outside, and as well as his roommates. When he tried to drop his bags off at his friend's warehouse, he was even barred from entering. So he spent several nights sleeping on the streets. And Ade, he spoke to BBC from a hotel in the city, and he said, quote, "Look how they're treating us, how they forced us out of our houses and forced us to self-quarantine." In fact, his test results, they were actually negative, and the city officials were still telling him that he couldn't go out. It's important to note that actually Guangzhou has become a very popular hub for Africans in China. Towards the end of the 2010s, hundreds of thousands were thought to live in the city, and I'm talking about African people. In fact, many of them entering the country on short-term visas to buy goods from nearby factories and send them back to the continent. And according to some estimates, there were more than 200,000 dwelling in the city of Guangzhou around this time. Some settled for long-term and many overstayed their visas. However, in recent years, the population of Africans has decreased. Now, this is because of a variety of different discriminatory policies. In fact, businessmen have complained about unfair visa restrictions and unfair treatment. In fact, in 2018, small hotels in Zhao Beilu, I know I'm butchering that, a popular area for African traders, they temporarily turned away Africans from several nations. A man even from Sierra Leone, he said that in Guangzhou, Africans are being demonized because there has been a rise in foreign imported cases. But the majority are from Chinese nationals, and that's the same thing that the professor was saying in the video you just watched. To date, the Chinese government has officially reported 1,566 cases of COVID and 8 deaths in the Guangdong province. Now, mind you, Guangdong province is where Guangzhou happens to be. However, there is no evidence that it's disproportionately represented in the African community. Across China, however, Africans are saying that they're facing increased scrutiny. For example, on the deserted campus of Wuhan University, African people are outnumbering Chinese people. And even when Wuhan, which was where the outbreak started, even when they ended their lockdown on April 8th and things started to normalize again, African students on campuses, they still aren't even able to leave the grounds of the university. And they don't even have any info on when their own lockdown will be lifted. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that there's also been an increase in xenophobia against Asian people, especially in North America, even in Africa. Hell, even in Toronto, we're seeing people being spit on, Asian people being spit on and kicked on, and that's just disgusting, right? You shouldn't be targeting a group of people because a virus happened to start in a certain part of the world. Like, you shouldn't be going after a group of people just because of this pandemic. It's disgusting. Even in Africa, we're seeing some of these cases. Like, for example, there was a video that recently surfaced on social media. Apparently, it was taken in Kenya, and it showed a man berating these two Asian people in the airport, saying that, "Oh, you guys have coronavirus, you have all these things," and for all we know, the people probably didn't have anything, and it's disgusting to see. However, what separates those incidences from what's happening in China is that the governments in, like, let's say Canada and Kenya, they're not implementing policies that are specifically going after a certain group of people. However, unfortunately, in places like Guangzhou, that's what's happening. I mean, even when you look at the nickname of the city, it's called Chocolate City. Like, you want to tell me that they don't have, very discriminatory beliefs towards Africans? Like, give me a break. Come on. Like, it's honestly, it's very heartbreaking to hear. And unfortunately, like, anti-black discrimination in China, this dates back to the 1960s. So around this time, African students first came to the country as part of a Chinese government program of fully paid university education for the nationals of friendly countries. So this was an attempt, it was trying to bolster the Chinese image and their third world credentials in the wake of the Sino-Soviet split. So while there were no reports of generalized anti-black hostility initially, the March 1962 beating of a Zanzibari by Beijing hotel officials' attendants in a dispute over the sale of cigarettes led to sit-ins and hunger strikes by Africans, most of whom returned home. So an altercation at the Shanghai Textile Engineering Institute in July of 1979, this set a pattern for a number of conflicts between Chinese and African students that culminated in the 1988-89 Nanjing racial conflicts. So the Shanghai incident, that started on July 3rd, 1979. during an exam period. So Chinese students, they complained of loud music played by Africans at night and referred to them as black devils. So in the ensuing fight, a Chinese trying to mediate this whole scuffle that broke out, he was stabbed and injuries were reported on both sides. The next morning, Africans were stoned and the foreign student hall of residence besieged by Chinese throwing bricks. So protests against African students in Nanjing and other cities between late 1988 and early 1989, they started to receive wide press coverage. What happened in Nanjing, it was that there was this anti-foreign sentiment directed mainly at African students, and this resulted in riots on Christmas weekend in 1988, which injured 13 people. So, the official news China agency, in a report after the protest in Nanjing, they put their own spin on the events that happened, and they described it as an attack by African students on university employees, which led to a clash between African students and Chinese students, and then to a demonstration by Chinese students calling for a punishment of alleged assailants. So you can already see in the framing that they're already trying to build this narrative that, oh, look at these rambunctious Africans, they're just partying, they're acting wild and doing stupid shit, but that's not really what happened in this case. What these attacks showed was that there was a widespread racial prejudice in China towards black people even back then. Even one of the common terms that was used to describe Africans in China was the term black devils. So, yeah, really all this shows is that yet again, African people are being demonized. Like, it's heartbreaking because even when you look at mainstream media, you're not really seeing anyone really talking about it. Like, you gotta really go search up online. And yeah, I give credit to like Al Jazeera and like outlets like The Guardian, but you're not really seeing CNN talk about this. I don't hear CBC speaking on it. So all I say is just keep your eyes open. We should all be trying to raise awareness about this. We should all try to combat xenophobia at any instance because like this is not how we're gonna combat this whole pandemic by just targeting groups of people and demonizing them. It's just we really don't need this right now, especially when the world is more divided than ever. Anyways, thank you very much for listening. That's all I got to say about this for now. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.